Welcome to a collection of games, most of which received various heaps of criticism from the press, players, or biggest fans of their respective genre and/or franchises that I enjoyed. I've long accepted that I may suffer from an incredibly poor taste in games, and having spent time analyzing Max Payne's footsteps, it's certainly not from an inability to nitpick, nor is it from disagreements of what these games do poorly. When the masses are delving into the weapons of Quantum Break, repetition of Dragon Age 2, shoebox levels of Invisible War, or plot of Mirror's Edge Catalyst, I'm in that choir, chanting and clapping along, except for the chorus that proclaims these games suck. They're fatally flawed, and far, far from reaching the heights of their potential or predecessors. But the positive qualities in story, combat, atmosphere, and presentation, respectively, were enough for me to enjoy and sometimes even revisit them. Though Perfect Dark Zero can go, the moon gravity is just too much. And Killzone. That frame rate, good grief.
Really called that one PlayStation Magazine.
But upon reflecting over all the controversial and forgotten games consumed with pleasure, I questioned, what's the weakest link? I couldn't rank them from best to worst in a linear fashion, but which is the worst of the ones I like? Does it change with each rotation of the sun like my favorite game of all time does? Is it unique? And is it even all that bad or just average with a mechanic, setting, or theme that strikes a chord with me? Well, the only rule of this game is that I do have to enjoy and not merely tolerate it. So something like Shadow of the Tomb Raider doesn't count. In fact, our first candidate is about as polar opposite to the forgettable but polished AAA game as one can get. Years ago, I referenced the annual ModDB Mod of the Year Awards, and one of the nominees in 2009 for Best Multiplayer was The Haunted, a third-person zombie shooter mod for Unreal Tournament 3. Thing is, Unreal Engine 3 was so advanced in its technology that many of the most notable mods more resembled full independent games, and thanks to licensing, many of them eventually were. The Haunted, after winning Epic's Make Something Unreal contest, being one such case. But by the time it was released to critics for XBLA money in 2011, rather than Unreal hardcore fans for free in 2009, it wasn't met with the same fanfare. Outlets viewed the game as a mediocre zombie shooter during a time when the subgenre had been tackled by bigger teams in Treyarch, Capcom, and Valve. That may be harsh, but it's not unfair. While The Haunted struck the zombie zeitgeist at its hottest point as a mod, by 2011 people expected more than 8 levels, 3 weapon types, 2 modes, and waves. Issues go beyond a lack of content though. Characters are a charisma vacuum, zombies spawn obnoxiously close, weapon tiers aren't remotely balanced, the massive levels can be lapped in seconds, animations are machinima quality, the color palette is so Unreal Engine 3 it's painful, and I just don't care. Because mowing down horde after horde with dual-wielding revolvers, shotguns, and a minigun before leaping 3 stories with no fall damage to do it all over again is too much fun. Those with a keen eye might have spotted this game's appearance in my last video, and you couldn't get more opposite to Resident Evil 2 Remake. There's no immersion, subtlety, quiet time, or sophistication in its design. Between everything I listed earlier, combined with powerful weapons, explosive corpses, and flexible levels, the game cheaply sets up insane swarms that make for exciting action. Even when fleeing in this game, I find myself turning around to throw sticks of dynamite or whip out the revolvers for a quick kill, and the scoring meter's multiplier encourages that aggression. Other encouragements appear in the form of stones, objects on the map which activate upon taking damage, either preventing devastating storms or restoring your health. The catch is that these stones can be stolen by enemies. I don't exactly know the logistics, if the zombie carries it, swallows it, or somehow embodies the boulder, but regardless, these stones become a moving objective that'll sometimes be obstructed by even more enemies, facilitating those intensely fun slaughters. The game's crude, but not mindless. This also appears in probably my favorite aspect of the game, weapon upgrades. Rather than an uneventful setup wave where you buy weapons off a wall or shop, here weapons are earned in the midst of combat. For every kill, a little XP bar is filled up, and when completed, the next enemy kill drops the upgrade, to which you decide what of the 3 weapon types you want to invest in: pistols, shotguns, or automatics. And it's worth keeping an eye on, for there's potential that upgrade drops in a spot that'll require taking damage to collect. Though, if you survive, it's possible to earn health back through your kills. That's likely why enemies spawn so close to you. If they didn't, it'd be possible to earn health at such a rate from such a distance, one could survive forever. It's not the most elegant solution, and will lead to deaths you don't deserve. The biggest problem with this game, though, is its lack of content, but not in the way most mentioned. There's a decent variety of enemy types visually, but not functionally. The overwhelming majority are just humanoids that rush you in a linear profile. There's a good list of fun-to-fire weapons, but you can easily achieve all upgrades in one match, and some pistol tiers are merely akimbo repeats of earlier ones. And of the 8 maps, neither's all that distinct in their design, visuals, or layout. Featuring more game modes, levels, and waves wouldn't have addressed the game's repetition, because it's built into the core design. There were definitely better co-op shooters to purchase in 2011, but this is where gaming criticism gets interesting. Does one judge this game based on the market or what it sets to achieve? I understand why critics chose the former as consumer advisors, but now that time's passed, I believe the latter's more appropriate. In judging this game in its Resident Evil Mercenaries-esque framework, it's the digital equivalent of sour keys, churros, or hard lemonade. Deliciously trashy. Though, if you're looking for Resident Evil and trashy, there's always the 6th installment. Now, I won't delve into this game here as I've already done that before, but its appalling attempts at pursuing the mainstream franchise of the day ended up being a lot more entertaining, albeit for the wrong reasons, than what the mainstream got the following year. While making Call of Duty 4 years later, I was disheartened to discover many of that game's drop concepts ended up in Call of Duty Ghosts, a game that even the franchise's most faithful veterans lambasted upon release. Famously, when EA and DICE were hyping the world with unrivaled destruction technology, Activision and Infinity Ward were finally catching up to Gears of War 2. Even I broke tradition and chanted the choir's chorus, labeling it as the first ever collage video game due to my belief it didn't feature a single speck of originality. The series has the perfect example of a franchise playing it safe, but there's a difference between playing it safe and simply not giving a shit, and Call of Duty Ghosts is definitely the latter. Thank God I got over my edgy phase. So I booted up the campaign for the sole intention of recording a 10-minute clip, and played for 2 hours. This doesn't make any sense. I never liked this game. Why would I like this game? My debut features me criticizing this game. And in fact, let's revisit that exact sequence, though without the broken contrast. Much better. Now, this turret segment sucks, because the game does little to immerse players in the chaos of battle as you're separated from said battle on top of a porch no enemy can enter, in the name of letting players whip out their remote in a safe environment rather than granting agency as the earliest entries did, even in levels with a similar layout. Thing is, the turret segment's not even 5 minutes long, and right after that, I'm immersed in the same battlefield chaos I spent thousands of words praising in Modern Warfare. Not the straitjacket restriction found in Sledgehammer's Advanced Warfare or World War II. There's multiple approaches to checkpoints, enemies react dynamically to your actions, and the endless barrage of guns, grenades, and death makes it feel like you're merely one soldier on the battlefield, like this series is supposed to. Visit any mainstream review for a poorly received military shooter in the early 2010s and you'll see various users complaining that Call of Duty gets 10 out of 10s for doing the same. What I confirmed upon replaying Battlefield 3 and Medal of Honor is that's a surface level appraisal. Now, I very much enjoyed these games for their multiplayer experiences where development was concentrated, but in campaigns they do not come close to matching the scripting, enemy density, and effects of even the biggest black sheep in Call of Duty's history. Well, second biggest. The games certainly look, sound, and move more convincingly than Infinity Ward's dated technology, but they don't effectively mask that all you're doing as a player is pointing and clicking. When enemies ambush in Ghosts, it's rarely 1 or 2 enemies, but a dozen, with lots of details in the level to suggest an even greater battles taking place in the background. And these vast stretches do contrast with quieter sections or action set pieces that are earned through effective build-up in a mission's opening. Clockwork stood out as a personal highlight as it features everything. Sniping, disguises, infiltration, ambushing, drilling, defending, escaping, blasting, it's a complete roller coaster. Infinity Ward, even in their lesser games, understand firefights need flexibility and set pieces need context. That it's better to give the player a convincing reason to follow orders rather than force those orders. The context of being inside an enemy base, dressed as the enemy, surrounded by the enemy, is enough context for me not to draw my weapon, and the payoff for that brief stint is worth it. So yeah, even though I would have been the one sending these Steam messages just a few years ago, I didn't at all mind my time revisiting this game, enjoying sections I previously memed with everybody and appreciating their pacing, atmosphere, and artistry. As said though, while I don't chant the chorus, everything else is on the table. My criticism 3 years ago of this game having far too many tutorialized gimmicks doesn't need a rewrite. There's rarely a stage where the game isn't pedantically informing you of something to press that'll never reappear but replaces something else. What's more is these gimmicks are contrasted with others that actually affect gameplay. Legends Never Die takes place in a flooding city, but rather than purely existing for a scripted escape sequence, it plays into core combat arenas, where the player is able to hide underwater during firefights. This is a good gameplay twist, as is sneaking through the jungle with more intel but less firepower, or fighting underwater without the hit-scan weaponry we're so used to. And most importantly, these are proper gameplay sequences. You're not given a mission fail because the enemies spot you during stealth, nor is there an absolute set path. They very much follow in the footsteps of all gillied up. The same cannot be said for robot sniping, rappelling, or minigunning. I also didn't realize just how many goddamn times this game pulls the shoot blinded enemies ambush. You do this with tear gas, night vision, strobe lights, thermal goggles, and of course, this is combined with the mandatory slow-mo breaches. In fact, this game loves slow motion so much it even inserts it into scenes that don't showcase anything. This knife sequence doesn't need slow-mo, but it's obviously done to sell the spectacle. So what's the purpose here? It's also quite evident just how rushed this game's production is when the gameplay gimmicks it sets up are given the least attention. In Struck Down, the mission's running with a good setup, tagging trucks, spying with a remote sniper, and busting through enemy defenses. But here's what that 50 caliber weapon sounds like. For reference, Modern Warfare's 50 cal sounds like this. Call of Duty's trademark production value is all over the place here. The art direction is outstanding. The technology is dated. This weapon sounds menacing. This one sounds miserable. The casting is notable. The voice acting's anything but. While an enjoyable mess, it is still a mess. And that could be used to describe almost all of Infinity Ward's output post Call of Duty 4. But if that's the case, then it raises the question of why this one's disliked when it shares so much of its gameplay with the Modern Warfare trilogy. Speaking in regards to campaign, I think it's relatively simple. Personality. The plotline in Ghosts is dumb. Like, really dumb. But so were Modern Warfare's 2 and 3, and as I realized last year, COD 4's events have holes. But it's rather remarkable how much you can get away with in the story department as long as your characters have charisma. And that's what the Modern Warfare series had, in their protagonists and villains. This game has none of that despite all of its efforts. But in regards to story, trust me, we can go even lower. These days, I really try to avoid Michael Bay jokes and references as they're beyond played out, and less impactful after he directed 13 Hours. But I can't with Need for Speed The Run. Not when EA went out of their way to tell you exactly who they admire. They even used music from Revenge of the Fallen in the main menu on development builds. While the team themselves might have been inspired by Bay, the marketers milked it. And EA's pandering knows no bounds.
Sports Illustrated and Need for Speed The Run teamed up to take Sports Illustrated swimsuit models Irina Shayk and Chrissy Teigen off the pages of the legendary swimsuit issue and into the game.
And this isn't a case where marketing is cloaking the sophistication. This game's tale makes Call of Duty Ghosts campaign read like War and Peace. Our main character, Jack, is in debt to the mob and participates in a cross-country race to win and pay off. How much money? Don't know. To what mob? Don't care. You'll never know. The game never says. But even if you raise a middle finger to the emphasis EA put on story, you'll then discover the game's all of 2 hours and has none of the features I've praised Heat for restoring in dynamic cops or customization. This game was developed by Black Box, the studio behind classics like Hot Pursuit 2, Underground, and Most Wanted, and the run was sadly the last game they produced themselves before closing their doors in 2015, which sets up the narrative that the run is to blame for their closure. And perhaps that's true, but if so, I don't believe they deserved it, because the run's a game I've replayed multiple times since its release and hold it above several games that received far more coverage from players and critics. Why? Well, because the sport's about nailing a run of tarmac over and over and over, repetition is unavoidable, and is a component of their enjoyment. It's thrilling to nail the perfect line through a circuit, especially amongst your competitors, but it leaves the door open for something different, something that the run accomplishes. Built on the concept of the Cannonball Run, a race that begins in San Francisco and concludes in New York, you're always making progress in the campaign, rather than revisiting the same corners and environments that populate this genre. And while there's repetition in always driving quickly as a Need for Speed title, that's what we're here for, and the game does this extremely well. Handling's heavy to evoke the heft of these machines while being precise enough to squeeze through tight gaps that plague these high-speed freeways, unlike Criterion's efforts where steering felt vague and power slides operated like Burnout. It's certainly more in keeping with Black Box's previous titles, but thanks to the game's generosity, high speeds are reached much earlier here than in Underground or Most Wanted. The sense of speed is phenomenal, featuring the excellent effects the series is known for, but on tight, windy, believable roads spanning across the country, it's only more enjoyable. Stages often surround you with steep cliffs, tight shortcuts, and rocks to further sell the fantasy of illegal street racing. Even highways earn their thrills thanks to increased traffic, constantly darting between lanes, and in the event of a screw-up, there's checkpoints. And what a depiction of the USA it is. While the use of Frostbite was what impressed people in 2011, oh how times have changed, the artist made the most of DICE's technology. Whether you're in the mountains of Colorado, city streets of Chicago, or forests of New Jersey, the game is beautiful when you're not running into Windows 10 errors. The game's terrible PC port is responsible for crashes, bugged effects, locked frame rates, and audio issues. The last is of particular shame because the run's crowning achievement is stellar sound design, held together by what I consider to be by far Brian Tyler's best work. Luckily, there's a sound fix for Windows 10 users by running VSync separately on your graphics app of choice rather than the in-game settings. The PC version also patched its 30 FPS lock ages ago, though cinematics aren't affected. The end result is a game with presentation that is not only superb, but unique to this particular entry. And that's what Black Box always did best. Even their weaker entries still had a character in audio, music, voice, and visuals to make each game stand out. Hot Pursuit 2010's a beautifully crafted game, but it's one that I've already played. Same for Most Wanted 2012 and Rivals. But the run, there's no other racer like it, and considering its generally forgotten status, I don't think that'll change anytime soon. Which is sad because while I appreciate this game, there's so much more to be done with this concept. Branching pathways, varying conditions, various modes, a move to Europe, and perhaps a story with somewhat likable characters? There's a great game somewhere here, but until that's realized, I'll settle for the good game that exists. And that's what I view this as, a good game, which doesn't satisfy our criteria. There's a pattern here. The run came off of two heavy-hitting, highly rated departures. Call of Duty Ghosts was preceded by arguably the most ambitious and feature-rich title in the series, and Hell's Reach was late to a party filled with VIPs. Each game's reputation honestly has more to do with the context of their release rather than the games themselves. So there must be a game that's inarguably bad here, rather than average in a more established franchise or genre that I liked, besides Resident Evil 6. And then, scrolling through my game list on Steam, it hit me. And it was so obvious.
Best of luck on Siege. Have a good stream. Thanks, man. You too. Have fun with, I don't know what game you're playing right now, but
Have fun with it.
Whatever game you're planning on making a video about next, have fun with it. Alpha Protocol. Ooh!
In this video's trend of connecting prior ones, I've mentioned how the gameplay systems of latter-day BioWare, while decent enough, frequently breaks its animation, levels, and combat just when you're about to be immersed. Alpha Protocol takes this to an inconceivable degree. It's quite puzzling Obsidian's espionage RPG never struck gold with the Let's Play community, because it only takes one level for this game to generate strong reactions.
The mission, like what I did happen. What? Mike Thornton. Okay, enemy. What the f? Yes, it is.
We had an interview.
What the f? What?
God, Ray, calm down.
Ray,
Extra brown.
What? You'll see it, what?
Obsidian Entertainment. We released broken games before it was cool. But this game's issues go far, far beyond bugs. After all, Fallout New Vegas was well received and Alpha Protocol wasn't. Likely due in large part to the mediocre at best presentation that's often worse. Let's compare, shall we? Here's Mass Effect 2 and here's Alpha Protocol, running on the same engine in the same year. Even when the game finds itself in the exotic locations one expects from a globe-trotting spy thriller, there's such a lack of detail in textures, lighting, and effects that luxury mansions and yachts look like Gary's mod. Now, I'm sure some of you were wondering, why did I play Weeaboo bangers rather than Alpha Protocol's own soundtrack? Two reasons. 1. Ethos is a massive weeaboo. 2. Despite the talent roster, most tracks that accompany gameplay are severely lacking. It attempts to bridge the stylings of Bond, Bourne, and Bauer and never quite comes together, mainly from the lack of melody, something that Mass Effect and Deus Ex didn't give up. What those games did sacrifice, however, was choice, at least compared to their spiritual predecessors, due to the combined desires of higher fidelity graphics, animations, full voice acting, and streamlining. Alpha Protocol may technically have all of those, but it applies them completely differently than any RPG released at the time. In Mass Effects 1 and 2, you can travel to various different locations in whatever order you choose to experience their isolated stories that conclude with a final puzzle piece connecting to the greater plot. In Alpha Protocol, you can do the same, but the order of locations visited will increase those stories in the characters you encounter, how you deal with them, and how they relate to others. And those interactions feature what I believe to still be the best dialogue system in a fully voiced RPG. Not only is there nothing to stop players from selecting whatever options on screen, they must commit to those choices within a reasonable time.
Nice digs. I see where all that Black Ops funding really goes now.
And there's great flexibility within the system. What other RPG released in this era lets me start a boss fight one moment and work with said boss multiple missions later? You can even buy dossier information on characters and use it in relevant conversations. Obsidian went to absurd lengths to follow the player's actions without robbing their agency in these story segments, and all of this is taking place in an espionage-ridden world that's an ideal setting for games to exploit, yet so rarely do, especially in role-playing games that portray every world, but one that approximates ours. And while buggy at best and broken at worst, what Alpha Protocol is more than both is unique. Even the combat has a certain catharsis. I know technically it's a complete mess, and as mentioned, makes Inquisition and Andromeda seem fit for release, but here's how I view it. If Alpha Protocol's moment-to-moment gameplay was completely intact, without any of its baffling AI, poor animations, awkward scripting, and collisions, it'd just play as a generic cover shooter, like every video game made during this era, and would only be less entertaining for it. So, Alpha Protocol is without a doubt in presentation, gameplay, and polish the worst game of the bunch here. Even a group of modders working in their spare time made superior visuals in Unreal Engine 3. But I enjoy Alpha Protocol more than all of the games featured. When reviews describe how Obsidian's bugs dampen the game's enjoyment, I see no reason to argue against that, because they're not incorrect. But they do hold a different perspective than me. One that means this game can't be the worst game I enjoy in my eyes. Weeks ago, I was asked a question that's inadvertently stuck with me. Why do you love Black Lagoon so much? It was from a friend who watched alongside me and very much enjoyed it, but obviously not to the point of almost becoming part of their channel's identity. Playing through all of these games, however, confirmed why I love the movies, shows, books, comics, and games I do. Others could be more impressively directed, acted, written, drawn, and designed, but don't elicit the irrational but compelling draw that brings me back to my favorites again and again. Doom 16 and Resident Evil 2 Remake earn similar praise by critics and share a surprising number of even objective qualities such as graphical fidelity, but one pulled 20 hours from me and the other tripled that. What's my point? I guess it's that for me, and I believe a majority of people, the things we like and love aren't just about being the best. I'd bet that everyone watching this video has music, movies, shows, games, and more they enjoy that make others believe they're insane, which you've probably said to others at some point about something they enjoy. I know I have, and that's okay. One of the things that excites me the most after finishing a video on a particular game is watching everybody else's. Because I know no matter how many articles read, interviews sat through, or playthroughs completed, there'll always be something I don't see that someone else does.
If 3 humans are in a room, there will be 6 opinions.
It's true, and I enjoy listening to most of them. That's not to say analyzing content isn't important. I very much believe the opposite. It's only through studying and debating what games do and don't do properly that effective feedback will travel. But I do think gaming communities sometimes get a little too worked up in justifying or fighting a game's status. Alpha Protocol didn't get a favorable response, and it's important to bring that up in relation to the game's context, but it doesn't affect my very real enjoyment. Reviews, comments, and awards have a purpose and should be kept, but I can't help but be disappointed a little bit when I hear someone praising or dogpiling a game, not from what they've experienced, but heard. Because if I did the same, there'd be dozens and dozens of games I would have enjoyed left untouched. And speaking of analyzing, I didn't mention Alpha Protocol on a whim. You have to live in either the Titanfall universe or the Mass Effect universe for the rest of your life. Which do you choose and why? The one I wrote fanfiction for. In all seriousness, I say Mass Effect mostly because the games allow you to experience the universe beyond arenas. I've seen what it's like to be a civilian there. Perhaps I would go for Titanfall if I read up more on the lore or had a game that expands the universe. Wink wink, nudge nudge, EA. Is this video over? Basically. Now you've played Doom Eternal, will you do Doom 3 years later? After I do Quake 4. What is a game you would want to see remade as a VR game? Having completed Half-Life Alyx and adoring how it made me feel like an ordinary Resistance member rather than the savior of Earth, an ODST game in VR has endless potential, enabling the dream of realizing how imposing the Covenant truly are to someone without the benefit of 8-foot-tall power armor. How much do you think Mick Gordon sacrificed to the devil to make his music sound so good? Employment. Will my father finally love me if I reach Diamond on Rainbow Six Siege? Now that Champion exists? No.